You're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in the world on the 24th of July of 2026. Today we have a lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first, let's talk about the conflict on the territory of Ukraine, where just during the previous 24 hours, at least 3 massive attacks took place. There were 2 massive attacks during the previous nights. One of them was carried out by Ukrainians. The Ukrainians attacked in the northern direction, trying to destroy and to damage and to destroy logistics of the city of St. Petersburg. Furthermore, the Ukrainians attacked in the eastern direction, in the direction of the settlement by the name of KYIV, targeting an object of the military infrastructure, and the Ukrainians attacked in the southern direction, trying to damage or to destroy the object of logistics on the territory of the city of Simferopol. The Russians carried out 2 massive attacks. One of them was during the night. The Russians were attacking different objects across the entire territory of Ukraine, and the second one was something like a retaliatory strike. The Russians attacked the city of Kyiv using ballistic missiles, and as a result of the Russian retaliation, the Ukrainians, as I understand, suffered huge losses. So now let's discuss everything in details, and once again, let's start with the Ukrainian massive attack that took place between the 23rd and the 24th of July of 2026. According to information we have, the Ukrainians used more than 470 drones to attack the territory of Russia, and this picture we saw yesterday in the evening, and this picture was published somewhere around at 20 past 11 p.m. and here we have dozens of arrows in different directions. Furthermore, the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation this morning confirmed that indeed during the night the Russians intercepted and destroyed 571 air vehicles. The Ukrainians, as a result of the overnight attack, managed to destroy 2 logistic warehouses through the southern parts of the city of St. Petersburg, and we have lots of videos on this matter, and here we have at least 2 fire anomalies through the southern parts of the city of St. Petersburg. 2 warehouses, 2 biggest warehouses on the territory of Russia, were destroyed as a result of the overnight attack, and obviously this situation will lead to unpredictable consequences. These attack and these destroyed warehouses can cause damage not just to the Russia's logistics, but the most important to civilians and private business. Furthermore, the Ukrainians attacked deep inside of the territory of Russia. The Ukrainian missiles and drones were flying to the south of the city of Moscow, further in the northeastern direction towards the settlement by the name of KYIV. And as for this settlement, the Ukrainians attacked this military facility, and the sources reported that at least 1 or 2 buildings were badly damaged by the Ukrainians. Furthermore, when talking about the Ukrainian side, at the same time when we start receiving reports about the situation with KYIV, the Ukrainians published this video where we can see the process how Ukrainians were launching missiles. So pro-Ukrainian sources claim that this is exactly the moment when the Ukrainians launched missiles that later attacked and destroyed several facilities on the territory of the city of Kyiv. And the third wave of attack moved in the southern direction, and as a result of attack, the Ukrainians, according to information we have, attacked another logistic hub of Russia in the area of the city of Simferopol, and as you can see, a huge fire broke out right after the Ukrainians attacked the territory. So the sources reported that this overnight attack was one of the biggest attacks from the Ukrainian side, at least since the beginning of this year. The Ukrainians used hundreds of drones and probably maybe even dozens of missiles, and as you can see, the Ukrainians managed to achieve significant results. The Russians, as we discussed at the beginning of this video, launched 2 waves of attack. The first one was before the Ukrainian massive attack, and the second attack was a retaliation strike, and the second attack took place right after the Ukrainian massive attack ended. So let's discuss everything in details, and first let's talk about the report that was published by the Minister of Defense of Ukraine. This morning, the Minister of Defense of Ukraine reported that as of the overnight attack, the Russians used 185 air means to attack the territory of Ukraine. The Ukrainians reported that they managed to bring down 164 vehicles, air vehicles, including drones and missiles. Explosions were recorded through the city of Odessa. Explosions were recorded through the cities of Pavlograd and Petropavlovka. Gas station and the warehouse were destroyed. Explosions were recorded through the city of Izum. According to information we have, a gas station or this facility was destroyed. This is the post office that was damaged, badly damaged and destroyed. Explosions were also recorded through the city of Dergachi to the north of the city of Kharkiv. As you can see, another warehouse was destroyed. Explosions, many explosions, as you can see, were recorded through the northern parts of Ukraine. And we have, for example, this video where we can see dozens of episodes of Russians were attacking different objects through the northern parts of Ukraine. Some of them were located through the city, through the Chernihiv region. Some of them were located through the Sumy region. So as you can see, lots of explosions. And the Russians finished with the overnight attack. Then the Russians were mainly concentrated on repelling the Ukrainian attack. And when the Ukrainians finished with their massive attack, the Russians struck back. And we start receiving first reports that the city of Kyiv was under attack. The Russians began launching one ballistic missile after another. In total, pro-Ukrainian sources reported that they managed to calculate up to 10 ballistic missiles that struck the city of Kyiv. And later we start receiving reports that the Russians attacked not the city of Kyiv itself, but a small village to the west of the city of Kyiv. We're talking about the village of Kapitanovka. So basically, the Russians attacked this facility, and the sources reported that there was something like a military event on the territory of this facility connected to drone technologies and protections against drones. So there were lots of people, according to information we have. Zelensky stated that rescue operation is currently underway in the Kyiv region after a Russian strike by Russian rockets. Unfortunately, there were casualties among civilians, according to Zelensky. For example, this is the first photo that was published right after the Russians attacked this facility, and later we received reports that up to more than 100 people, civilians, suffered as a result of this attack. And this is something like an official data published by pro-Ukrainian sources. And if official sources reported about casualties in 100 people, this means that there could be much more people that suffered from this attack. Furthermore, right after this attack, the pro-Ukrainian sources published additional report about the daily attack. The pro-Ukrainian sources reported that the Russians during the day used 95 air means to attack the territory of Ukraine, and the Ukrainians managed to bring down 82 air vehicles, including drone and missiles. The Russians, according to this report, used just 3 Iskander missiles. 2 of them managed to hit that facility where the Ukrainians had that military event, and one of the missiles was intercepted by the Ukrainian side. And furthermore, the Ukrainians emphasized that the Russians during the day were also attacking the city of Odessa. And as of the city of Odessa, according to pro-Ukrainian sources, the Russians were using Onyx missiles. And here we can see the consequences of attack. As you can see, some facilities, some buildings, some constructions were destroyed by Russians as a result of the daily attack. And furthermore, according to information we have, most likely during the upcoming night between the 24th and the 25th of July of 2026, the Russians will carry out a massive attack. The Russians managed to accumulate more than 4,000 drones, and most likely the Russians will continue retaliation. Most likely in coming night we'll see more attacks from the Russian side, especially in the area of the cities of Kyiv and Odessa. And furthermore, during the day we were receiving lots of updates that the Russians began redeploying of their strategic aviation from the far east in the direction of the western parts of Russia towards the settlement of Engels and Saratov. The Russians began preparations. Most likely during the upcoming night, the Russians will use strategic aviation, the Russians will use Iskander missiles, the Russians will use Ha-101 missiles, and the Russians will use probably 1 or 2 hundreds of drones. So that's it. Probably the Russians will use up to 4 or 450 air means to attack the territory of Ukraine, but not more. Most likely the Russians will attack objects of energy infrastructure. The Russians would attack most likely military facilities, warehouses, businesses, maybe even malls through the entire territory of Ukraine, especially through the central part and probably even through the eastern part. So this is the situation, and this is how the things most likely are going to develop. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation on the ground. During the previous 24 hours, we received lots of very important updates. And first, let's talk about the Kharkiv direction, because the most important updates are coming right exactly through this area. From this area, according to information we have since the beginning of the 16th of July of 2026, the Russians, as you can see, have improved their position significantly. For example, this is the 16th of July of 2026, and this is probably the moment when the Russians launched their major offensive operation, their next stage of the Kharkiv major offensive operation. And as a result of this major offensive operation, first the Russians managed to encircle the settlement of Bely Kolodezh from the west and from the east, cutting the main supply lines. Then we received the report that the Russians managed to dig in deeper, especially through the eastern flank of the city of Bely Kolodezh. Then the Russians began advancing from the border deep inside of the northeastern parts of the Kharkiv region, and the settlement of Artelny was captured by Russians. Furthermore, during the 24th of July, during the previous 24 hours, both the Minister of Defense and the Group of Forces North reported that Russians captured at least 2 villages in this area. We are talking about the village of Ivashina, which is located basically along the border, and the settlement by the name of Zakharovka. So now we have no doubts that the Russians will continue their offensive operation, and as of this stage of the Kharkiv offensive operation, the Russians most likely are tasked to establish complete control over the northeastern parts of Kharkiv region. This will allow the Russians to create something like a buffer zone through this territory. So these are the territories that the Russians are tasked to take under complete control, and these territories have the highest priority for Russians. If this part of the northeastern parts of Kharkiv region falls, then the Russians will approach the next defense layer of the armed forces of Ukraine that lays between the settlements of Rubezhne, Bugaevka, Shevchenkovo, Pershe, all these small villages, Petropavlovka, Novoalexandrovka, Prikolotina, and the settlement of Vilkhovatka. So this is the second defense layer of the northeastern parts of the Kharkiv region, and if this defense layer falls, then most likely the Russians would be able, without significant resistance from the Ukrainian side, to approach the third defense layer of the northeastern parts of the Kharkiv region. And we're talking about the territory between the Pechenegi water reservoir, the settlement of Shevchenkovo, and then the settlements of Savintsy and Balaklia. So this is the third defense layer between rivers, as you can see, between water reservoirs and natural barriers. And this is probably the task of Russians until the end of 2026. And considering the current pace of the Russian offensive operation through the entire northeastern parts of the Kharkiv region, we see that probably the approach of the third defense layer is really possible from the Russian side. And don't forget that the Russians, during the previous days, managed to establish almost complete control over the eastern bank of the river Oskol. And there are also very high chances that when the Russians approach the settlement of Veliki Burluk, the Russians would try to cross the river Oskol using broad frontline attack with the purpose to shorten the distances to the Shevchenkovo defense layer. At least these days, we have lots of updates of how Russians were bombing and attacking positions of the armed forces of Ukraine through these territories, trying to soften defenses of the armed forces of Ukraine before a possible major offensive operation. As for the Slaviansk-Drushkovka agglomeration, today we received the report that the Russians, the first sabotage and reconnaissance groups of the armed forces of the Russian Federation, answered the settlement of Nikolaevka from the southeast. If you remember, during the previous days, we had reports that the Russians managed to answer the settlement of Nikolaevka, more precisely the former Slaviansk power station from the northeast, and now we start receiving reports that the Russians managed to do the same from the southeast, which means that the Ukrainians are no longer able to support this defense layer. Most likely, the Russians continue concentration of their troops through the settlement of Nikolaevka, trying to collect the critical mass before the Russians reveal their main positions and before the main battle for the settlement of Nikolaevka begins. Most likely, the Russians are tasked to finish the battle for the settlement of Nikolaevka before fall comes, so before the 31st of August of 2026, with the purpose to begin a very long and very important autumn battle,
Moment, was? Dieser Baum ist riesig. Sieh dir das an. Erst wirft man den Baum in diese Maschine. Hack, hack, hack und schwupps verwandelt er sich in einen riesigen Holzstapel. Dann werden diese LKW in einer Reihe aufgestellt, um sie zu
military campaign of 2026, and we are talking about the battle for the main cities like Slaviansk, Kramatorsk, and Drushkovka. Furthermore, and a very important situation, the Russians are about to finish the battle for the pockets between the cities of Konstantinovka and Chasov Yar. These are the changes on the ground between the days. Today, pro-Ukrainian sources published this video where we can see how Ukrainians were attacking Russians in this area, and based on this video, we came to the conclusion that the Russians began a battle for the pocket with the purpose to maintain the lines and to force the Ukrainians to fall back. When the Russians finish the battle for this pocket, the Russians would be able to release additional troops and forces with the purpose to use them further in the offensive operation along railways. Obviously, the Russians are planning to move along railways in the direction of the city of Kramatorsk, and while moving along these railways, the Russians would be able to make flanking maneuvers in the direction of the settlements of Drushkovka and Alexeyevka-Drushkovka, and in the direction of the villages between the city of Kramatorsk and Seversky Donetsk-Donbass Canal. So, as we discussed many times before, the battle for the Slaviansk-Drushkovka agglomeration may happen much faster than anyone can expect and could be finished much faster than Zelensky can imagine. So this is the situation in this area. At the same time, after the Russians attacked this territory to the west of the city of Kyiv, today we have a meeting of the President of Ukraine, Zelensky, and with the new Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Drapati, and today, according to them, the Ukrainians are preparing also retaliation, so which means that between the 24th and 25th of July of 2026, we might see counter strikes from the Ukrainian side, also using hundreds of drones and dozens of missiles. But the Ukrainians, once again, most likely would continue attacking warehouses and different facilities in the western and the central parts of Russia. Now let's move further. As for the Dobropolye and Zaporozhye directions, during the previous 24 hours, we haven't received anything special. We just have lots of videos where we can see how the Russians continue bombing positions of the armed forces of Ukraine through the entire Zaporozhye direction, trying to soften defenses of the armed forces of Ukraine. But when talking about the major battle in this area, we still see that the Russians are still very far from the beginning of this major battle. As of now, the Russians are mainly concentrated through the eastern flank of the Zaporozhye direction, trying to get the city of Orekhov as close as possible from the east and from the northeast. But despite the fact that the Russians are still very far from the beginning of the battle for the city of Orekhov, the Russians are moving, and sooner or later the Russians would be able to approach the city of Orekhov from these directions and to begin the major battle for the city itself. And that's it for today. The